is the third video in a series with me, Matthew Slater, and Dill Green, talking about the Credit Commons as a series to introduce the Credit Commons. So, if you have a mutual credit group and all the people within it are happily trading with each other, generally those groups are quite limited, because if you've only got 10 or 100 people within the group, it's sometimes very difficult to give as much as you receive to members of those groups. Some people will be producing something very common, other people will be producing things which are relatively obscure or specialized. And so it can be difficult to participate. And this is a problem that that always happens with these groups, whether they're in local Let's groups or time banks or the more business-like systems. So there's a very natural solution to this problem of having two small groups to be able to exchange very much. And that solution is to make existing mutual credit groups. So you call this nesting of mutual credit.
So the way that works is that each group works in exactly the same way, except that some groups are groups of groups. So you might have in London, say, you might have a Brixton group and a Southwark group and a Battersea group and a Westminster group. And those would have, a few hundred businesses in each. Then there would be maybe a South London group in which all those groups would have a single account. And that would do two things. It would mean that the business in Brixton, which was doing too much business in Brixton to be able to recycle all of its credit in Brixton, could spend across London, and then maybe an equivalent business in a different borough in London could spend back on things that some of the less successful members of the Brixton group were providing. The other thing that this nesting provides for is more complex supply chains. Almost nobody certainly in Western economies, has anything in their house or in their business that was entirely created within the locality. And as much as we like the idea of fostering relocalization and circular economies, there's an awful lot of transition time needed to support that. And in the meantime, long supply chains are absolutely necessary to being able to carry on with our lives. People in cities can't grow food, so there are supply chains that reach out into the countryside, for a very simple example.
So just as in a local group, every member must give as much as they receive, and they share a ledger to record how much each has given and received. If you want to trade with a member of another group, then between the groups, you have to have a ledger to say how much each group has given and received in relation to the other groups. And then one transaction with someone in another group will go on your ledger and their ledger and the parent ledger. And then the same amount will need to come back from their ledger back to your ledger in order to achieve balance between the groups. And that's how you avoid using money. You promise that you will get your account back to zero.
You don't promise you'll get your account back to zero at any time. You just promise that you will always work towards that aim. And there are mechanisms for rewarding you by increasing your allowed credit, the more obviously your account is continuously working its way back to a state of balance. This possibly slightly out of sequence, but there's some very interesting things about mutual credit units that comes into play here. A mutual credit unit is purely a piece of information. It doesn't have a serial number. What matters is the level in your account, not how many things you own. And what that means is some very interesting feedback loops. come into play, which are a bit different than they are with real money. So if you have £1,000 in your account, you might think, great, I've got the freedom to go and spend £1,000 anytime I want. But if you've got 1,000 mutual credit units in your account, what that actually means is that this network, which is not propped up by the government and the state and courts and tanks, but propped up by the trust between you and your fellows, that 1,000 is only valid as long as those other businesses are in the network. And that's obviously a much less solid thing than a nation state. So it's in your interest to spend those thousands because you're at risk if you don't. And what that does is it tends to increase the velocity, which is a technical term that economists use, but basically it means how quickly money changes hands. And as we said in an earlier episode, money only ever does any good when it changes hands, because there's usually an increase in the amount of value being produced in the group at that point. So this whole notion of flow and circularity are new dynamics that pop out naturally from the very basic function of the way that mutual credit works. It's a better form of money for the sort of world that we want to see.
There's another restriction that happens with mutual credit as well, especially when you're going between groups or with many levels of nesting. And that is that if one group has consumed a lot more than it has provided, or provided a lot more than it has consumed, it may not be possible to continue trading with them in that direction. Because just as on your own account, you have a minimum credit limit below zero and a maximum credit limit above zero, so all the groups have credit limits. And so if your group is exporting and exporting and exporting, and you want to sell something to another group, well, it's possible you might just have hit your limit at the group level. And so what's needed to solve that problem is politics and negotiation between the groups. And this is something that doesn't really happen in the money system, because in the conventional money system, the aim is to get as much money as possible, not to balance trade. And in the credit commons, the aim is for social justice, which means balancing trade and preventing accumulation.
And there are mechanisms that are in development for taking mutual credit on a stage into what is often called the commons transition, which is using these trade imbalances as a means and a vehicle for investment in the productive capacity of the disadvantaged members of the group, but on the basis that the investment results in a common asset that is worked by the disadvantaged members of the group. And then that phrase that we hear and are very cynical about, a rising tide floats all boats, actually can begin to become something that is mirrored in actual reality experience.
This also happened under the gold standard, when it was much more important to balance trade, and all the countries got wealthier together in the 50s and 60s.
So I think that's probably enough for this episode. So we'll see you on the next.